Picture this. It's July 2022, and a team of archaeologists is digging through more than 5 feet of compacted earth at a rock shelter called San Lazaro, just outside Segovia, Spain. Someone's trowel uncovers a stone, and almost instantly the entire dig stops. Not because it's damaged or unusual in any typical archaeological sense, just because it's wrong somehow, in a way nobody can immediately put into words. It's an oblong granite pebble, roughly 8 inches long, worn smooth from decades sitting in a riverbed. And pressed into its surface are 3 shallow natural hollows arranged in a pattern that makes the whole crew stop digging and just stare. Study co-author Maria de Andres Herrero, a prehistory professor at Madrid's Complutense University, later recalled the moment with total simplicity, saying she and her students looked at that stone and almost in the same breath all said the same thing. It looked like a face. And sitting right in the middle of that accidental face, exactly where you'd expect a nose to, was a small, faint reddish mark. At first, barely anyone gave it a second glance. It looked like nothing more than a mineral stain, the kind of thing archaeologists walk past constantly on any dig site. But this particular mark, on this particular stone, buried in a layer, packed with unmistakably Neanderthal stone tools, ended up not going to another archaeologist for further study. It went to TAIS, Spain's National Police Forensic Division, the exact same unit that solves modern break-ins and homicides. And when those forensic scientists finished their work, they confirmed something that overturned one of the most stubborn assumptions in the entire study of human evolution. That red mark wasn't a stain at all. It was a fingerprint. It belonged to a Neanderthal. And it had been deliberately placed on purpose exactly where a nose belongs on a face, roughly 43,000 years ago, making it, according to the team behind the discovery, the oldest complete human fingerprint anyone has ever found anywhere on the planet. To understand why, archaeologists needed actual criminal forensics to crack a 43,000-year-old mystery. You first have to appreciate just how unusual this stone was compared to everything else typically pulled from a Paleolithic dig. Most items recovered from Neanderthal occupation layers are exactly what you'd expect from a hunting and gathering existence. Tools, shaped for cutting or scraping, animal bones, bearing butchery marks, the ordinary physical residue of daily survival. This pebble had none of that. No wear marks consistent with use as a tool, no signs it had ever served any practical function at all. Geological testing traced the stone back to the nearby Eresma River, roughly 3 miles from the rock shelter, where it was eventually unearthed, meaning someone, at some point roughly 43,000 years ago, picked up this exact stone from a riverbed and deliberately hauled it more than 3 miles to where Neanderthal families were living. That detail alone told researchers something significant. Nobody accidentally carries a useless rock 3 miles. Somebody chose this stone on purpose. Now, the research team, led by archaeologist David Alvarez Alonso, worked methodically through every mundane explanation before letting themselves consider anything more dramatic. First question, was that reddish mark simply a natural mineral inclusion baked into the granite, the kind of thing that occurs in certain rock formations with zero human involvement required? Using scanning electron microscopy alongside multispectral imaging, techniques that analyze a surface's chemical makeup with far more precision than the naked eye ever could, researchers determined the pigment was iron oxide. Better known as ochre, a mineral Neanderthals across Europe are already well documented to have collected and used to decorate objects, and quite possibly their own bodies. That result ruled out a simple mineral stain and confirmed the mark had been deliberately applied using material Neanderthals were already actively seeking out for exactly this kind of purpose, but confirming it was ochre still left a much harder question sitting unanswered. Was this red dot genuinely a fingerprint left by a Neanderthal? Hand, or just a random meaningless smear of pigment with no intentional shape behind it whatsoever? This is exactly where the research team made a decision that, in the world of Paleolithic archaeology, was genuinely unprecedented. Instead of leaning purely on traditional archaeological methods, they brought in Spain's Central Identification Unit within the General Commissary of Scientific Police, the country's National Forensic Division, the same team responsible for matching fingerprints from active modern crime scenes to suspects in criminal databases. Using imaging technology normally reserved for present-day investigations, forensic analysts examined that tiny red mark in extraordinary microscopic detail, and what turned up settled the question for good. Buried inside that mark, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under proper imaging, were 13 distinct identifying dermatoglyphic features, the technical term for the ridge patterns unique to every human fingertip, complete with specific ridge endings and bifurcations, precisely the kind of granular detail a modern detective would rely on to match a print at a crime scene to a suspect on file. The individual ridges sat roughly 0, 48 millimeters apart, spacing forensic analysts determined was most consistent with the right index finger of an adult male. Bringing in the forensic team also solved a second, equally important problem, ruling out modern contamination once and for all, confirming beyond doubt the print didn't belong to any archaeologist, student, or conservator who had handled the stone since it came out of the ground, a step that matters enormously in this kind of work, since even careful modern researchers can accidentally leave their own prints behind while excavating or cleaning a delicate artifact. With the pigment confirmed as deliberately applied ochre and the mark itself confirmed as a genuine, uncontaminated human fingerprint, researchers arrived at the final, most provocative question the entire study would ultimately hinge on. Was the placement of that fingerprint, sitting precisely where a nose belongs, relative to the stone's two other natural hollows, resembling eyes, pure coincidence, or did it represent something deliberate, a Neanderthal individual? Recognizing a face-like pattern in an ordinary stone and consciously choosing to complete that resemblance with a single, carefully placed mark? This tendency, the human brain's habit of spotting faces and other meaningful patterns in random, ambiguous shapes, is well documented in modern psychology as pareidolia, the same basic quirk responsible for people seeing a face on the surface of the moon or in the grain of a wooden door. To test whether this particular placement was too precise to be accidental, researchers turned to Monte Carlo simulations, a computational method that runs thousands of randomized scenarios to calculate the odds of a given outcome happening purely by chance. The results were striking. According to the study's statistical analysis, there was only a 31% probability that the ochre mark's precise alignment with the stone's natural nose, shaped hollow, occurred randomly. In other words, the placement was almost certainly deliberate, reinforcing the team's conclusion that whoever pressed their ochre-stained finger onto that pebble roughly 43,000 years ago wasn't making an accidental mark. They were finishing a face. The implications reach straight into one of the oldest, most contentious debates in the entire field of human evolutionary science, the question of whether Neanderthals, the stocky, heavy-browed cousins of modern Homo sapiens who dominated Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing roughly 40,000 years ago, were genuinely capable of symbolic thought and something resembling art, or whether they were fundamentally more limited than the modern humans who eventually replaced them across the continent. For most of the 20th century, both scientific and popular consensus leaned heavily toward the second view, painting Neanderthals as brutish, purely practical survivalists, incapable of the kind of abstract thinking that produced cave paintings and personal ornamentation among early Homo sapiens. That consensus has been steadily crumbling over the past 20 years, worn down piece by mounting physical evidence, and the San Lazzaro fingerprint stands as one of the most direct, most personal, and hardest to dismiss pieces of evidence yet offered in that ongoing fight. As the study's authors put it themselves, the pebble represents the oldest known non-utilitarian object bearing a fingerprint discovered anywhere in Europe. Language deliberately chosen to underline that this object served no practical purpose at all, existing purely, as far as researchers can tell, as a deliberate act of symbolic representation. This discovery doesn't stand alone either. It's the newest addition to a genuinely substantial, rapidly growing body of evidence that has quietly rewritten scientific understanding of Neanderthal cognitive capacity over the past 15 years. In southeastern Spain, at a site called Cueva de los Aviones, researchers have documented perforated marine shells dating back roughly 115,000 years, shells that appear to have been deliberately pierced and coated with pigment, almost certainly worn as jewelry, made by Neanderthal populations tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe, to potentially teach them anything of the sort. Deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, researchers found something even stranger. A series of deliberately built rings made from broken stalagmites, arranged in a structured circular pattern deep within total cave darkness, dated to an almost incomprehensible 176,500 years old. A construction project that required coordinated group effort, some form of artificial light to navigate the pitch-black cave interior, and a shared sense of purpose researchers still debate the meaning of today. And in France's Loire Valley, at a site called La Roche-Cotard, researchers identified deliberate, spatially organized engravings carved directly into a cave wall, sealed off from any possible later human access by naturally accumulated sediment more than 57,000 years ago, well before modern humans ever arrived anywhere near that specific region. Engravings that current evidence attributes exclusively to Neanderthal creators based on the stone tool technology found alongside them. Individually, each of these discoveries chipped away at the old assumption of Neanderthal intellectual inferiority. Together, alongside the Sani Lazzaro fingerprint, they build a picture of a species that looks increasingly difficult to separate from modern humans in terms of raw, symbolic, and artistic capacity, whatever genuine differences may have separated the two populations in other respects. The San Lazaro rock shelter carries particular scientific weight in this broader story because of exactly when and where this fingerprint was left behind. The site sits along the Eresma River Valley in central Spain, and the archaeological layer containing this marked pebble has been tied to unmistakably Mysterian stone tool technology, the specific tool-making tradition linked exclusively to Neanderthal populations rather than modern humans. And crucially, the Iberian Peninsula, covering modern Spain and Portugal, is recognized by researchers as one of the very last European refugia, where Neanderthal populations managed to survive, clinging on in isolated pockets even as modern humans steadily spread across the rest of the continent, and Neanderthal populations collapsed and vanished almost everywhere else. That means this specific fingerprint dated to roughly 43,000 years. Hago was left behind by one of the final generations of Neanderthals to ever walk the earth, individuals living through the literal twilight years of their entire species, not long before Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil and archaeological record for good. There's something genuinely striking, almost unbearably poignant, in the idea that one of the very last deliberate creative acts by an entire vanishing human lineage survived intact into the present day, preserved by nothing more than a smear of iron-rich pigment and roughly 5 feet of accumulated sediment, waiting more than 40,000 years to be uncovered by a team of archaeologists who, by their own account, initially assumed they were looking at nothing more than an oddly shaped rock. The story of the San Lazaro fingerprint is also tangled up with a much larger, much more recent scientific story unfolding around the exact same period this population of Neanderthals was living, this one told through genetics rather than physical objects. In June of 2026, a separate research team led by geneticist Alba Bossoms Mesa at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a major study in the journal Nature, examining genetic material recovered from 26 individual Neanderthals across sites in Belgium and France, including a newly sequenced high-quality genome from a 45,000-year-old individual found at Goyet Cave in Belgium, only the 5th such detailed Neanderthal genome ever successfully produced anywhere. The genetic picture that emerged adds a genuinely fascinating new layer of texture to this same final chapter of Neanderthal history. Unlike Neanderthal populations previously studied from Siberia's remote Altai region, who showed clear genetic evidence of repeated inbreeding among close relatives, a telltale sign of small, isolated, genetically struggling populations, the northwestern European Neanderthals, studied in this newer research showed no such signs of close relative mating. Instead, researchers found that Neanderthals from Belgium and France were more closely genetically related to each other than to other contemporaneous Neanderthal populations scattered across Europe, pointing to the existence of a distinct, regionally connected Neanderthal population in the far west of the continent, one that still maintained broader genetic and, quite possibly, cultural ties stretching across considerable distances. Taken together with the San Lazaro discovery, this genetic research paints an increasingly detailed portrait of exactly what kind of population was actually capable of producing something like a deliberately placed fingerprint on a face-shaped stone, not a scattered handful of cognitively limited stragglers clinging to survival in isolated pockets, but genuinely interconnected regional communities maintaining social and genetic ties across real distances, right up until the final chapters of their long existence on the European continent. The tools now used to extract and interpret this kind of evidence, whether it's genetic material pulled from ancient bone or dermatoglyphic ridge patterns preserved in 43,000-year-old ochre, have themselves been transformed by the same broader wave of computational and artificial intelligence advances reshaping nearly every corner of modern science. Forensic fingerprint analysis, the exact discipline Spain's National Police Forensic Division applied to the San Lazaro pebble, increasingly relies on machine learning models trained to detect and classify ridge patterns and other identifying features. With a level of speed and consistency traditional manual analysis, however skilled, simply can't match working purely by eye. Similar computational advances have transformed ancient DNA research over roughly the same period with modern sequencing technology and increasingly sophisticated bioinformatic algorithms now capable of reconstructing usable genetic information from degraded material that researchers working even a decade earlier would have considered completely unrecoverable. Put those two advances together, and researchers studying deep human prehistory are no longer limited to interpreting stone tools and skeletal remains in isolation. They can increasingly cross-reference physical, forensic evidence like the San Lazaro fingerprint directly against detailed genetic reconstructions of the same regional Neanderthal population, building a far richer, far more textured picture of exactly who these final European Neanderthals actually were, not merely an abstract, vanished category of extinct hominin, but genetically traceable communities capable of individual, deliberate, symbolically meaningful acts of creativity. The The researchers gave their unusual pebble an affectionate, thoroughly modern nickname once the significance of the find became clear, calling it Perico, a playful homage to Pedro Delgado, the Spanish professional cyclist who won the 1988 Tour de France, a nickname that captures something genuinely charming about how a team of serious academic researchers related to this small stone once they understood what it represented. And the comparison to a modern crime scene investigation, which might initially sound like little more than a clever marketing angle for a scientific press release, actually reflects something scientifically substantive about how rigorously this particular claim needed to be tested before publication. Extraordinary claims in paleoanthropology, particularly claims involving Neanderthal symbolic behavior, have historically faced intense scientific scrutiny and skepticism, precisely because the stakes of the underlying question, whether an entire extinct human species possessed genuine capacity for abstract, symbolic thought, are so significant to our broader understanding of what actually makes modern humans cognitively distinct, if anything, from our closest evolutionary relatives. By enlisting actual criminal forensic scientists, rather than relying purely on traditional archaeological interpretation, the San Lazaro research team built their case using an entirely independent line of scientific verification, one specifically designed within modern forensic science to withstand exactly the kind of rigorous cross-examination a courtroom trial would demand, applying that same standard of evidentiary certainty to a 43,000-year-old cold case with no living witnesses and no surviving suspect to interview. Isn't quite the very first fingerprint evidence ever tied to ancient hominins. Researchers point to an earlier, considerably more fragmentary print discovered decades earlier at a site called Königsaue in Germany, unearthed back in 1963, potentially older than the Spanish discovery. But that German find is only a partial impression, lacking the kind of complete, richly detailed ridge pattern that allowed Spanish forensic analysts to extract 13 distinct identifying features and confidently assign the print to a specific sex and likely age category. That distinction matters enormously for what researchers can actually conclude. A partial, incomplete print can confirm that a hominin hand touched a surface at some point in the deep past, but it can't support the kind of detailed forensic analysis capable of determining whether that individual was young or old, male or female, or whether the mark represented a deliberate act rather than an incidental brush of a hand. The San Lazaro print's completeness is exactly what allowed it to support such a specific, well-supported conclusion that an adult male Neanderthal deliberately pressed his ochre-covered right index finger onto a stone he'd personally carried more than 3 miles from a riverbed, positioning that single mark with enough precision that modern statistical analysis treats pure coincidence as a near impossibility. This entire body of evidence also sits inside a much larger genetic story that has reshaped how scientists think about the actual relationship between Neanderthals and the modern humans, who eventually replaced them across Europe. A relationship that turns out to be far more intimate than a simple story of one species outcompeting and displacing another. Genetic sequencing of modern human populations has repeatedly confirmed that nearly everyone alive today, whose ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa, carries measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of their total genome. The direct genetic legacy of interbreeding between Neanderthal and early modern human populations that occurred repeatedly across tens of thousands of years of shared occupation of the same landscapes. Some of those inherited genetic fragments continue actively influencing modern human biology today, affecting everything from immune system function to skin pigmentation to sleep patterns, a genuinely strange kind of biological inheritance passed down from a species that otherwise vanished from the fossil record roughly 40,000 years ago. Framed against that backdrop, the San Lazaro fingerprint stops looking like evidence from some entirely alien, cognitively separate branch of the human family tree, and instead reads as direct physical testimony from close biological relatives, individuals who, whatever behavioral or cognitive differences ultimately separated them from the modern humans spreading across the same continent, were capable of exactly the same fundamental impulse that drives a huge share of human artistic behavior, even today, looking at something ambiguous, recognizing a face within it, and reaching out to make that resemblance complete. What ultimately makes this discovery so effective at capturing public imagination, beyond the genuine scientific rigor behind it, is how deeply personal and immediate it feels compared to almost any other category of archaeological evidence available to researchers studying deep human prehistory. Stone tools tell you what a population was capable of doing. Animal bones tell you what a population ate. Even skeletal remains, however emotionally resonant, primarily tell you about biology, how a person lived, what they ate, how they eventually died. A fingerprint is different. It captures something closer to a single, fleeting, deliberate moment of individual intention, one specific Neanderthal on one specific day, roughly 43,000 years ago, picking up a stone that happened to look like a face, deciding that face was somehow incomplete, dipping a finger into red ochre and pressing it down in precisely the right spot to finish what nature had only partially suggested. As study co-author and geologist Andres Diaz Herrero described the moment of realization during the research process. Seeing that perfect fingerprint sitting exactly where a nose should have been on that ancient stone was, in his own words, simply amazing. 43,000 years later, using imaging technology originally developed to catch modern murderers and burglars, a team of Spanish scientists reached back across one of the deepest gulfs in the entire human story and confirmed, beyond reasonable statistical doubt, that a member of an entirely different, now extinct species of human once looked at a rock, saw a face, looking back, and reached out to make it whole. The broader scientific debate this single fingerprint reignited shows no sign of settling quickly, and researchers studying Neanderthal cognition remain genuinely divided over exactly how much weight any single artifact, however compelling, should carry in resolving a question this fundamental to how humanity understands its own evolutionary story. Skeptics within the field have long cautioned against over-interpreting isolated finds, pointing out that a single marked pebble, however statistically improbable its alignment, can't by itself prove Neanderthals possessed a fully modern capacity for symbolic thought on par with early Homo sapiens, and that genuine scientific certainty on a question this significant will require continued accumulation of independently verified evidence from multiple sites across multiple regions, rather than reliance on any single dramatic discovery. The San Lazaro research team has itself been careful, within their published academic paper, to frame their conclusions with appropriate scientific caution, presenting the statistical improbability of random placement as strong supportive evidence for deliberate symbolic intent, rather than as definitive, unassailable proof beyond every possible alternative explanation. But taken together with the shell jewelry at Cueva de los Aviones, the deliberately constructed stalagmite rings at Bruniquel Cave, the sealed engravings at La Roche-Cotard, and now the detailed genetic portrait of a genuinely interconnected regional Neanderthal population in France and Belgium, the San Lazaro fingerprint adds one more, unusually personal data point to a body of evidence that has been steadily, patiently dismantling the old caricature of Neanderthals as cognitively primitive, evolutionary also-rans, replacing it instead with the portrait of a genuinely thoughtful, symbolically capable species whose final surviving communities, clustered in the last refugia of Iberia and northwestern Europe, were still creating, still expressing something recognizably like art, right up until the very last chapters of their long, now vanished history on Earth. There's a particular kind of vertigo that comes from sitting with this story for a while, the sense of two entirely different timescales suddenly colliding in a single small object. 43,000 years is a genuinely difficult number to hold in your head in any meaningful way. It's roughly 17 times longer than the entire span of recorded human history, stretching back well before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before anything resembling the civilizations whose ruins fill museums around the world. And yet, here's a gesture. One single human, or rather one single Neanderthal gesture, preserved with enough fidelity that 21st century forensic scientists can determine which specific finger made it and how old the person likely was. That kind of continuity, a private, personal act surviving essentially unchanged across a gap of time that dwarfs the entire history of writing, cities, and organized religion combined, is genuinely rare in the archaeological record, and it's part of why this particular fingerprint has resonated so strongly with both scientists and the general public since its publication. Most of what survives from the deep past comes to us as debris, discarded tools, broken pottery, the accumulated residue of ordinary labor. The San Lazaro fingerprint is something else. Entirely a moment of apparent play or wonder or creative impulse, reaching across the single deepest gap in the entire human evolutionary story to say, unmistakably, that somebody was here and somebody was thinking in ways we are still only beginning to fully understand.